Welcome to Eviliv3, the live media streaming show, commentary show, review show, gaming show. I don't even know anymore. I got to change that intro. But we always answer the question, how many splinters did Cheryl Williams get from those trees? Subscribe if you're new to the channel because today we are reviewing the original, the first, the sensation that took the world by storm in a cult film-like sense, The Evil Dead. Now, The Evil Dead is originally released, of course, on October 15, 1981. That was an original screening, and it was released a year or so later across the U.S. But my generation growing up, this film was sort of out of reach for us. It was almost like a snuff film. There was not a lot of high-res copies of anything. The best res you can get was, I think it was 480, which was equivalent of VHS. But then the VHSs were so worn down from being seen so much that everything was sort of blurry and the detail wasn't always quite there. We didn't mind back in the day because that's the only thing that was available. And so we just assumed that that's as good as it gets, right? So whenever this film came out, trying to get a copy of it, we finally got it with a bunch of friends. I think I was in high school when I first saw it. Got it with a bunch of friends, sat down, watched it all together, and it was, again, it was like a rite of passage watching this film. It was terrifying. It was gross. It was scary because, again, like a snuff film, it was very much blurry enough that the high-res versions that we have today, where it shows all of every single nitty-gritty little piece of pixel, back then it didn't have it. And so now if you're watching it, the makeup, the practical effects don't really hold up as well. But back in the day, because it was all blurry in VHS, it was totally believable. And it was amazing. Now, I don't want to talk about the legacy of this because ultimately this inspired horror films and horror filmmakers for generations till today. And it's so endearing to so many of us who love horror that it has 3 spin-off films. It's got a series, and there's another film coming out, I think later this year actually, Evil Dead Rise, that is also come out. And then of course, the other films like Cabin in the Woods and any sort of monstrous cabin type horror film, they got it all from this one. This was the original and the best. Just amazing. And it's not just the best because it was the first of its genre, sort of like this. A bunch of friends go to the woods, get possessed by demons, and, sort of hell unfolds. It's because of everything. I mean, one thing that you have to always remember about these shows is that, or any film really, it's not just the cinematography. It's not just the script. It's not just the director or the actors or the score. It's everything combined. And if you get everything combined, then you have something truly magical. So this is directed and written by Sam Raimi. I think he was 20 years old when he originally filmed this. The cinematography was by Tim Philo. The music was by Joe Loduca. And I want to really call out the music because, again, on VHS versions, you don't really see it. This was released again on the 40th anniversary. My buddy Cameron and I went out and watched it in the theater with our wives. And you really got the sense in a theater setting of the sound design. From the rafters going overhead to just the score playing behind the action to the incitement incidents and the score picking up into sort of a crescendo of frenzy to just the sound design of the actors. Who can forget crazy, freaky ass Linda just giggling, sitting on the floor? Just that sound design alone was unnerving, unsettling, annoying, frustrating, and everything. Okay, so the swinging of the seat as we sort of enter into this. The setup is this. Here's the log line. 5 friends travel to a cabin in the woods where they unknowingly release flesh-possessed demons. Yeah, that's kind of it. Ultimately, what it's become is a sort of institution of conceptual sort of Necronomicon demonic possession horror. But at the very beginning of this, it wasn't even called the Necronomicon. Sam Raimi actually wanted to call the film The Book of the Dead, but producers didn't want, or the studio didn't want the book in the title because they were afraid it would turn kids away because the kids didn't like books of all the stupid reasons. But that's fine. The Evil Dead was just as good as the Book of the Dead. But instead of it being called a Necronomicon, it was Naturen Demonto, as the voiceover by Bob Dorian, who played the Professor Nobi's voice, presented us in that sort of wonderful recording that he was sort of reciting not only the backstory about how he got the Necronomicon in studying ancient Samaria and Kandar, but also literally reciting the passages which then awoke the Evil Dead. So as the Evil Dead sort of has built up this mythology around it, there's a role-playing game that I've had one episode on this channel, and we're about to do another episode here in a week. It sort of changes or evolves the mythology presented in this film into something where there's this entity called the Watcher, and the Watcher is what controls the woods and ultimately allows the demons to come up through the Necronomicon. And I mention this because at the very beginning, we see some eerie signs that this is going to be a different type of horror film. Not just from that chair swing, as the group, the cast members all come up to the cabin, and it was Scott who was trying to unlock the door, and this chair swing was sort of hitting the wall and then just stops on its own. That tells you there's a supernatural element that's about to sort of be realized. And as they're, sort of settling in for the cabin, and you see Cheryl Williams, Ash's sister, who's sort of the third wheel in this whole thing, or the fifth wheel in this whole thing. She's just sort of drawing, and the Watcher is sort of shimmering the perimeter, sort of going around the perimeter of the cabin and looking in the windows, and sees Cheryl sitting there drawing, and it sort of possesses her for a moment to force her to draw the Book of the Dead. And that's important to note because the Watcher is there whether or not the Kandarian passages are read out loud. The Kandarian passages will allow the demons to possess the living, but the Watcher's already been evoked simply because the Necronomicon ex mortis, or in this film they call it the Naturen Demonto, exists. So it was penned in human blood by ancient Sumerian priests in Kandar, whatever that means, and then bound in human flesh. Now, just a quick note about this version of the Necronomicon. Arguably, it's the worst looking version. I mean, they have, when Ash discovers it for the first time with Scott, he's sort of flipping through the pages, and it doesn't look good by any stretch of the imagination. The drawings are fun and great, but it doesn't really look like a ritual tome like you see in some of the other versions of this, whether it's the remake Evil Dead or Evil Dead 2 Dead by Dawn or Ash versus the Evil Dead, the Stars series that aired for, I think it was 3 different seasons. The Necronomicon itself looks infinitely better in later versions, but you have to forgive them. This is the very first time they got into it, and so what are you going to do, right? And so just because the book exists, that's how the Watcher is able to then tap into sort of the hell itself and draw demons out once these passages are read. So it's really just trying, when it's sort of takes over Cheryl's body and forces her to draw the Necronomicon, it's just trying to let them know that there's something else in the cabin itself. And then we see this as we cut to a dinner scene with that trap door as it flings open. Again, this is the Watcher trying to say, hey, get down in there. I need you to read from the passages from the book. I need you to summon these demons so we can do our, I don't know, evil stuff. It's like their job as a demon. And so ultimately it's Scott and Ash that go down there and check it out. Originally it's Scott, but he goes down and sort of investigates. Ash is going down very reluctantly, calling for Scott, who never answers him. And then they come across the record player and the recording device, I should say. Record player sounds like it's like an actual record, but it's not. The recording device and shotgun and the Necronomicon, and then the Kandarian dagger as well, which is always great. And one thing that I really love about the Kandarian dagger is later when it's actually used against the evil dead, you can see the blood coming out of its mouth, as almost as if it's drawing blood out of the demon, which is just a cool little note. They didn't have to add it, but I'm really glad that they did. So they start playing the record tape, and of course it's Professor Nobi who is reading or reciting that his wife was possessed, and it's because of this book. And we don't really get a lot because not only does Cheryl not want Scott to be playing it, but it also sort of cuts back and forth as Scott is sort of, trying to find the different passages and different pieces of it. So it gives us a little bit of an audio setup, and then it goes into him actually reciting the demonic passages. And that's when the Watcher fully comes out, gets all of its full power, and it actually has control over the woods themselves, which is pretty awesome. One thing I really love about 80s cinema is that they weren't really afraid to experiment. 70s and 80s cinema, they weren't afraid to experiment with stuff. That tree rape scene that Cheryl suffers through, they've done it again with the remake, which was great. Arguably, it was just amazing. It wasn't as good as in Evil Dead 2 wasn't as good as the original Evil Dead with that tree scene, and the Evil Dead remake wasn't as good as the original The Evil Dead tree scene. And again, it was very visceral, and it felt like she was truly being violated in a very intimate and visceral way. The other versions, they sort of feel a little hollow in comparison because it was so raw in this version and it played on so incredibly long. But ultimately, Cheryl hears something outside. Join us, as the Watcher is calling to her. And so she goes outside. Now, the only way you can really get possessed in this film is if you're scratched or cut or somehow the Watcher wounds you. And then those wounds open up demonic possession. So when she goes out there and the Watcher controls the trees and the trees rape her, and then she rushes back to the house and begs Ash to take her home, at that point, she is possessed. She has not fully been taken over by the demon, but that's where it sort of sinks its teeth into her, as so to speak. So Ash reluctantly says, okay, we'll take you back home. They try to go out, but you see the bridge is sort of broken and curled back on it. And Cheryl is convinced that there's no possible way they're going to get out of here alive. And so they head back, and Cheryl becomes fully possessed. She attacks Linda and Shelly. Shelly becomes the next one that goes sort of full demon. Shelly then attacks everyone else. One really quick note to talk about sort of the violence in this. There's probably the most graphic and disgusting scene in this entire film for me has to be that pencil in the heel scene. When Cheryl is completely possessed and attacking everyone, she brings the pencil down into Linda's heel and just wrenches it around. And it's just the most vicious, vile scene of this entire film. And it really, really gets you in your sort of horrified, parts of your body. It was just so gross. But I love it desperately. And so she, attacks everyone and sort of infects everyone. And what's great about this is it's sort of one after the other, only one at a time, but people start changing. Ultimately, they lock Cheryl into the basement trap door and put the chain over the trap door, and she's a perpetual antagonist from the actual cellar itself, constantly giggling and laughing, constantly tormenting people with her breathing and her talking and her snide comments and her screaming. And that's another aspect of this with the sound design is the demons are so obtrusive with their sound that it affects the actual viewers. Like it's hard to sit there and hear them screaming over and over and over again constantly through many minutes at a time of this film. It becomes annoying. And I think that's intentional. And I think it's a good thing that it's annoying because it's supposed to upset us as a viewer. And then, of course, we see Linda sitting cross-legged as soon as she turns with her white dress and sort of like giggling and laughing, sort of maniacal little girl. And she does this little nursery rhyme. We're gonna get you. You're gonna die. Stuff like that. And it's great to see Ash do his best to kill her, but he can't actually pull the trigger of the shotgun because it's his girlfriend. And then we get to the telltale traits of these deadites, before they're even called deadites, is that they like to trick. They like to play games, right? So they'll go from full deadite to flash back to the person they possess, and the person's just like, help me, Ash, I don't know what's happening, I don't know what's going on. And then suddenly deadite comes right back and rah, comes out and gets you again. It's so great seeing that switch being turned on and off to mess with the people, because it's not just, they're not just trying to murder you and take your soul, they're trying to torment you and then murder you. They want to torment you, torture you, then murder you and possess you. And so it's just a next level of just like a mass murder, you know? I mean, they really want to torment you, and that's what makes them particularly great, as opposed to, say, a monster in a monster movie or a slasher serial killer type creature. They really want to mess with your head. The camera angles in this film are brilliant, and they, again, have inspired many filmmakers later. But ultimately, how you get those sort of ground level spinning camera angles is Bruce Campbell, who plays Ash Williams, and Sam Raimi, the writer-director, were holding this wide 2x4 with the camera on top of it, and they were holding it in parallel, sort of running around with it to create those wonderful ground level camera effects from back in the day before they had super lightweight like cameras like phones in order to do the exact same effect very simply. And it's great to see it, because it does really feel like there's this otherworldly entity, the Watcher, chasing people down. And though they can see it and see what it looks like, we have no idea. And that, I think, is so wonderful, because even to today, after all these series and after everything, we don't know what it looks like when it's chasing them. We don't know if it's an entity chasing them. We don't know if it's like smoke or something, or just like a tree. Like it's just the Evil Dead, and you just have to accept that it's terrifying, even though you will never see it yourself. So this was made on a budget of $350,000 to $400,000. And to date, it's made over $2.6 million. So talk about a show that keeps on giving. This film is still drawing people to box office. It's still drawing people to go buy different versions of it, from VHS originally to DVD to Blu-ray to digital, and constantly buying it in new package sets and deals and combined with other films. And it's because it's so good. It's just a testament to the quality of this film and the impact it has on horror films as a genre, and those of us who love horror films as fans. Quick note for anyone interested, the shotgun used by Ash is a Winchester Model 37A single barrel. It's apparently a 20 gauge, as those are the shells used in the movie. And the chainsaw was a Homelite XL12, although the Homelite logos on both sides and the top were covered over with tape. So just a quick little note there. So they ended up, Scott, a wonderful moment of just craziness, kills his girlfriend, Shelley. I hope I'm not getting the names mixed up. But Shelley, completely dismembers her and stuff after she scratches him up and ultimately infects him to become a deadite as well. Cuts her up, and they end up burying her body. So by the time Scott is sort of out of it and transitioning into a deadite, Ash is looking at Linda, knowing he has to kill her, but he doesn't want to murder her. And even after he takes her out to the shed and straps her down with chains and starts up the chainsaw ready to like saw her into pieces, he can't bring himself to do it. There's too much humanity in this character, even in the craziness of demon possession. And so ultimately he takes her to the front yard and digs a hole for her and throws her in. And that's when she comes out in full force, and Cheryl breaks out from the cellar trap door that she was locked in. So Linda is attacking Ash. He finally gets knocked down to the ground, grabs a shovel, swings it around, cuts her head off, and she's still alive and kicking and stuff. But that ultimately kills him. You have to decapitate deadites. Ultimately, you want to bury them as well, just so you know. If you ever run across a deadite in life, dismember their bodies, bury them, and you won't be bothered by them anymore. Then he goes back, realizes Cheryl's gone, and then Cheryl, of course, starts tormenting him and attacking him, with Scott coming into also demonic possession and becomes a full-blown deadite. He throws the Necronomicon almost into the fire, but not quite. And this is something that they sort of renege in later versions and sequels of the Evil Dead mythos. Because in this version, again, it's not the Necronomicon, but it's still the Book of the Dead. In this version, it can be burned. And by burning the book, you then defeat the infected Deadites. It doesn't get rid of the Watcher, but it does destroy the Deadites. And so he's trying to get the book with the little necklace that he gave to Linda at the beginning of the film, and they're like attacking him and sort of dragging him away. He finally gets the book, throws it in, and we get this really great stop motion animation sequence that reminds me of that sort of, what is it called? Return to Oz with the rock creature. It's just really great claymation sort of animation. And it's a little bit hokey when you're watching in an ultra high definition, 4K restoration version. But on VHS, it's 100% believable as, everything in that era was through the VHS blurriness and pixelated view. But I still think it's just fun and it holds up watching them sort of deteriorate. And then suddenly the demon's arms burst out of the bodies and then they fall down and stuff. And the sunrise comes. Ash goes outside and the Watcher comes through the house and chases him down until he's screaming mouth. Like the camera comes up to his mouth screaming and then it rolls credits. Quick synopsis of the film there. But it was brilliant. I mean, every single moment of this, you're tied to the screen. You cannot look away. Even when you're annoyed by some of the sounds that these demons are making, you're still watching. And some of even the goriest scenes, you still continually seem to watch. Like there's a really great moment where Shelley is clawing at people's legs and Linda's clawing at Ash's legs, and you just feel like the flesh is peeling off their leg and the muscle is peeling off as well, even though you don't really see anything except for blood. The idea of it is enough, and the blood that's covering the legs is enough to really give you that visceral reaction of just horror. Watching that pencil go in, another visceral moment of horror. And you can see the masks and the practical effects coming off when they're demonic, when they're possessed as Deadites. But you got to forgive it because it's the first time they did it. They were kids. They didn't have a big budget. They didn't have a whole team behind them. It was just friends in the woods. And I think they did a brilliant job. So let's see. In later versions, they made it so the Necronomicon itself cannot burn, and they made it so it's, it's almost like impossible to damage it all, and you have to use spells within it in order to then defeat the Deadites or demons and send them back. And the Watcher himself gets a little wibbly wobbly with its sort of rules and stuff in later versions and in the series, but ultimately, it's still, everything evolves narratively as you continually add sequels. I mean, the mythology of Nightmare on Elm Street gets pretty hokey and crazy the deeper you get into it. Same with, any other horror film genre that has a series at its back eventually. So you have to forgive it for that. The cabin used as the film's set was also lodging for all of the 13 crew members, with several people sleeping in the same room. And the living conditions while they were filming were absolutely terrible. The crew completely complained the entire time. They didn't have any plumbing, so the actors went days without showering. They felt ill frequently because it was freezing weather at night. And by the end of the production, they were burning furniture in order to stay warm throughout the night. That's crazy. The original script called for all of the characters to be smoking marijuana when they're first listening to the tape. And the actors decided to try this for real, and the entire scene had to be later reshot due to their uncontrollable behavior because they were so high. They had to completely reshoot the entire scene. I thought that was a great little note. When you're just a bunch of friends hanging out, you're going to drink too much, you're going to smoke too much, you're going to hang out like friends, and you're going to forget that you're actually trying to make a film here. It's going to run away from you. And that's certainly what they experienced as well. This was originally a much longer film. Sam Raimi wanted to cut this. They had like 180 minutes or so. That's over 2 hours of footage for this film when they started editing it. And it was originally supposed to have those comedic moments of levity in order to cut the pure horror and make it a little bit more palatable to an audience. But what they discovered in the editing room was that the comedy didn't really work. And because it made it so long, it was better just to keep it as a straight horror. And when ultimately they went and did the sequel, Evil Dead 2 Dead by Dawn, they kept a lot of the humor in and sort of restructured it so that it was more in line with the original vision rather than how the first film, The Evil Dead, turned out. So Sam Raimi originally wanted the film to be called Book of the Dead, and the producer Irving Shapiro is the one that changed it to Evil Dead. On the tape in which the demon resurrection passages are read aloud, some of the words spoken, which appear to be in Latin, sound like Salmon Rob, das ist hikers don die Roza, which means Sam and Rob are the hikers on the road, and they were the fishermen on the road as well. The cameraman slipped during filming, smashing his camera into Bruce Campbell's face and knocking out several of his teeth. I never knew that before. Interesting little tidbit. And of course, Sam Raimi shot a short film called Within the Woods to act as a calling card for his feature debut. He did it in order to raise the money, and it ended up working. He ended up raising $90,000 in order to start making the film. And of course, in 2003, Evil Dead the Musical debuted in Toronto before making on to an off-Broadway run in 2006. So I'll ultimately get to all of the Evil Dead films, but I wanted to start with the original for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it's the only straight horror film of all the series except for the remake. The remake, I think it was in 2016, I think. It was brilliant. It was pure horror. Again, different actors, different characters, different sort of setup, but the outcome was the same, of course, dealing with the Necronomicon, the Watcher, and the demons, the Deadites, and possession. But for some reason, I keep going back to this film. I mean, I've watched it like 3 times in the last month, and there's a reason for that. It's because it's scary, it's exciting, it's horrifying, and it's the genesis of what ended up being this really beautiful and amazing sequel series of films that, again, are just above and beyond anything else in this sort of possession, cabin in the woods genre, and inspired everything that came after it. Hey, how you doing, man? 2013. Okay, thanks for the heads up on that. I knew it was in the 2010s somewhere. So you just have to really desperately love this original one simply because if it's not, of course, you know, the effects are just not good. They're just, I mean, they're good for when they were made, but to today's audience, what we're used to, they're just not good. But you still have to respect them because of what they had to go through in order to get them, because these were amateurs breaking into the industry, because this is something that ended up inspiring so many different people and genres that you have to tip your cap and just show respect for what Sam Raimi had done. And whether or not you like the comedic versions of the film series that were put out after this or not, you'll always have this original pure horror version to go back to if that's what you really want to sink your teeth into. Now, I personally love the sort of physical comedy that Bruce Campbell really brings into the role in later films, especially Dead by Dawn. It's just amazing. And of course, Army of Darkness is just a brilliant sort of slapsticky comedy, horror, fantasy film. So you have to appreciate it. I really love the series for the directions that it took and the chances that it took in some of those choices. Not all of them landed for me in the series, but overall, I thought it was great. And I did love the developing of the mythology with the series as well. I thought that did a brilliant job of just sort of taking all the loose ends of what this mythology is supposed to be and tying it down to one cognitive narrative. You didn't really get that with the films because they were, of course, owned by different production companies and different film industry companies as they were released and made. And so rights of the Evil Dead or Evil Dead 2 Dead by Dawn and even Army of Darkness were held by different people at different times. And so it was hard for even the people who made it, Sam Raimi, in order to use elements of some of these films in order to put them into his series with stars. That's kind of a messed up idea, but ultimately it ended up working out. And, we ended up with what is arguably one of the greatest franchises in all of horror, in my personal opinion. The cast and director effectively brutalized themselves to make this movie. Yeah, no, they straight up did. Aside from just the teeth being knocked out, there was tons of physical wounds. Bruce Campbell hurt his ankle and knee in this, and you can see him limping throughout some of the scenes, and that's because of the physical action that he was supposed to be doing and that he did, undergo. What else? I want to call out some of these cast members because they're still heralded and they still do this sort of horror film trade show circuit. So you got Bruce Campbell, who is just a goddamn gem of an actor. You gotta love Bruce Campbell, from Bubba Hotep to his cowboy series, Briscoe County Jr., which I own and I've seen every single episode of, and I still love, and I wish they could have done more of those because they're great. Everything he's done, I love that actor so much. But Ellen Sandweiss as Cheryl Williams, his sister, Richard Dan Menacour as Hal Dietrich, who played Scott, and then Betsy Baker as Linda, Teresa Tilley as Sarah York, who played Shelley, and then uncredited, you have Sam Raimi as the local fisherman and the voice of the Evil Dead. You have Robert G. Tappert as local fisherman, and you have Bob Dorian as Professor Noby's voice. So it's a very small, tight cast of friends and people that they could rope into making this, and it just ended up being a genuinely brilliant film that holds up over 40 years later, and I will continue watching it for the rest of my life because it's that good. Bruce Campbell still gets annoyed that no one asks him about Burn Notice. Yeah, I bet. Yeah, Bruce Campbell is a funny actor who I think with his age, he has sort of changed into a little bit more curmudgeonly, I think. But I always love seeing anytime he gets up on stage to talk about anything, you get all these really great behind the scenes stories. And he's always, sort of ribbing Sam Raimi. They're old friends. And so they like sort of busting each other's chops. And it's great to see two professionals doing that, even when they see such success. I mean, Sam Raimi, he has done incredible blockbuster films. Most recently, he did the Multiverse of Madness for the Doctor Strange sequel. He did, long years ago, he did the Superman trilogy, or Spider-Man trilogy, sorry, which at the time I absolutely desperately loved. Now it doesn't really hold up that well for me personally. But everything that he does do, and again, he's one of those filmmakers who you can tell the films that he has made. They have his stamp on them. Traditionally, that stamp is in the form of over-the-top, grotesque, buckets of blood type stuff, and comedy with the horror. That's really his calling card. And you see it in a lot of great films that I'm going to be talking about in the future on this channel. But I did want to start with this film because, again, we have that role-playing game that we're playing, and I just wanted to revisit it in a form where you're forced. The way that I do these reviews is I like to, look at some of the history of the films, and I get to see some of the information that is sort of like facts, like the did you know type facts about these films that I didn't particularly know, certainly not growing up watching them. And it allows me to sort of find information about these films that I would never have otherwise looked for if it wasn't for presenting these reviews to all of you. So I really do appreciate your time and attention, revisiting some of these old classics with me. I'm going to be continuing moving forward with not just the Evil Dead films, but also the Prophecy series. And what's the other one I started here recently? I don't know. There's so many different films that I have sort of in the hopper that I'm working on. But, look forward to those sort of reviews moving forward. And it's not just horror with this channel. We like to do a lot of other things. Arguably, Servant is more mystery than it is horror. Last of Us is a little more survival, post-apocalyptic than straight horror. And so you're going to get a lot of sort of random stuff, even all the way to fantasy with the Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon stuff. And if that strikes a chord with you, awesome. Tune in and join me, and it'll be a lot of fun. So again, next week, there is going to be an actual play or a live play of the Army of Darkness role-playing game. We're going to be going back to ancient Sumeria and dealing with some crazy Deadite nonsense shenanigans, 3,000 years BC, which is going to be a lot of fun. All the cast members are returning, so I'm really looking forward to that. And I highly recommend that you check this out. And of course, because it is so iconic, because the actors were so wonderful, because the director did such a fantastic job, I can't help but give this 5 out of 5 Evil Eyes. It is a perfect horror film, and it set off so many wonderful films that were inspired and filmmakers that were inspired by it. So check it out. You won't regret it. As always, remember that evil spelled backwards is live. So get your tookuses out there and be evil.